She's only here to clean. My dad, Raymond Ward, burst into laughter, kicking a tray of medical waste onto me in front of the sneering nurses. A disgrace who ran away to play soldier, and now you crawl back empty-handed. You're only fit to be the janitor for this family. I knelt on the freezing tile, biting my lip to endure it, silently picking up the soiled gauze with my bare hands. I tried to shrink myself, hiding my battlefield scars beneath my tight, cheap uniform. I accepted my father's ruthless trampling every single day as a sentence, a way to punish myself. But that arrogant, patriarchal man had no idea who he was trampling on, and he wouldn't be laughing for much longer. Not until the hospital's luxurious glass doors were kicked open by 8 soot-covered Delta Force operators. They completely overpowered the security team carrying a dying comrade and roared in absolute desperation, "Colonel Ward, please, you have to save him." Before continuing, please take a moment to like and subscribe to the channel, but only if you really want to know the ending of this story. And let me know in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is there. Ward General Hospital was never a place of genuine healing. It was a towering, sterilized monument to my dad's wealth and inflated ego. Elite patients paid exorbitant sums for minor cosmetic adjustments and VIP pampering. Amidst this civilian bubble, I existed as a total ghost. I wore a tight, cheap medical assistant uniform, a rigid synthetic fabric that served one vital purpose. It concealed the jagged, violent bullet scars crisscrossing my shoulders from 2 combat tours. My dad's voice would routinely cut through the sterile hallway, dripping with weaponized arrogance and entitlement. He refused to even look at me directly. Instead, he would adjust his perfectly tailored suit, peer down at his sycophantic administrative manager, and issue his degrading commands through her. He spoke to Beatrice while pointing a lazy finger in my direction. "Beatrice, tell that useless assistant to go change the diapers for the patient in room 3. Don't let me see her standing around idle." He spoke as if I were a defective piece of equipment, not his flesh and blood. I gripped the heavy mop bucket, my jaw clenched so tightly my molars ached, silently swallowing the immense humiliation to keep my cover intact. Beatrice sneered, a look of malicious delight crossing her powdered face as she shoved a dirty mop and a heavy bucket of contaminated water into my hands. Junior nurses like Sophie and Rachel gathered at the central station, whispering behind their clipboards, their eyes filled with a sickening mix of pity and outright contempt. They couldn't fathom why the director's own daughter was doing grunt work, and they loved watching me sink. I didn't argue. I didn't flinch. I gripped the rough wooden mop handle with the exact same hands that just months prior were clamping severed femoral arteries and pulling jagged shrapnel from soldiers' chests under heavy enemy fire. I maintained my composure through strict 4-count tactical breathing, treating this daily psychological torture not as an insult, but as a grueling interrogation I was ordered to survive. I lowered my head, intentionally breaking eye contact with everyone, and marched toward the biohazard waste room. I forced my posture to slump forward, deliberately burying the rigid, disciplined spine of an army officer under the heavy, shameful weight of a lowly janitor's daily grind. The physical exhaustion was absolutely nothing compared to the psychological weight that crushed my chest every single hour. Every nurse who walked past me saw a pathetic, broken woman pushing a mop. None of them saw the colonel hiding behind the bleach stains. Only when I was safely locked inside the dim, cramped supply closet did the iron facade finally crack. I leaned my back heavily against the cold steel of the storage shelves, sliding down until I hit the freezing tile floor. I slowly rolled up my restrictive sleeve, staring blankly at the thick white scar tissue wrapping around my forearm. A flash hit me without warning. Sand. Screaming rotors. My hands buried inside a chest cavity, slipping on blood-losing grip on an artery that was pumping a young sergeant's life onto the dirt floor. The image vanished as fast as it arrived, but the nausea stayed. I was a colonel in the United States Army. I was a combat surgeon who had snatched countless lives back from the edge. Yet I accepted this daily humiliating degradation completely willingly. Every cruel insult my dad hurled at me, every condescending sneer from a junior nurse was a potent dose of poison I eagerly swallowed. It was a calculated, brutal form of self-punishment for the one critical life I had failed to save on the battlefield. I convinced myself I deserved the pain. The grueling physical labor and the endless verbal abuse were tools I used to deliberately crush my own soul, bringing me a twisted, agonizing sense of relief from the survivor's guilt that threatened to drown me every time I closed my eyes. One afternoon, a young nurse named Jenna had accidentally left a patient chart on my cleaning cart. She came to retrieve it and paused, noticing the thick calluses on my knuckles and the rigid way I held the mop handle like it was a rifle stock. She tilted her head, something flickering in her eyes that looked dangerously close to sympathy. "Are you okay?" she asked quietly, almost reaching for my arm. I pulled the cart back sharply, my jaw tightening. "I'm fine. You should get back to your station." She blinked, startled by the command in my voice, then retreated. I watched her leave. For a brief, dangerous second, I wanted to tell her everything. I crushed that impulse the way I crushed every other weak thought, locking it behind the same steel vault where I kept the memory of Elias's face disappearing behind a wall of dust and smoke. My brief moment of respite ended precisely at the 3-minute mark. I stood up, resecured my mask of apathy, and pushed the squeaking cleaning cart back out into the blinding lights of the main hallway. My dad was waiting near the VIP elevators, parading a group of wealthy, laughing investors through the wing. As I passed, he deliberately kicked a dropped medical clipboard directly into my path, a silent public demand for total submission. My combat instincts immediately screamed at me to step forward and snap his wrist. I locked those violent instincts inside a heavy steel vault in my mind. I knelt down, slowly picking up the clipboard with cold, robotic precision, my face an absolute, unreadable blank mask. I handed it to Beatrice, my eyes completely dead, devoid of the defiant fire my dad so desperately wanted to extinguish. He smirked at the investors, gesturing toward me with a dismissive flick of his wrist as if to say, "See, completely tamed." One of the investors, a heavyset man in a cashmere coat, glanced at me and then looked away, uncomfortable. My shift finally ended, and the deafening silence of my bare, empty apartment served as a stark contrast to the hospital's cruelty. This agonizing routine was my life, day after day, setting the perfect stage for the one patient who would finally see right through my elaborate camouflage. Deep into the exhausting drag of my afternoon shift the following day, the crushing monotony finally broke. I was reassigned to the isolated VIP wing to tend to Arthur Miller, a 78-year-old patient suffering from severe end-stage heart failure. The second I stepped over the threshold of his private suite, the entire atmosphere shifted. There was no civilian softness in this room. Arthur sat propped up against the pillows, clear plastic oxygen tubes trailing from his nose, but his cloudy eyes were sharp, calculating, and predatory. He tracked my entry with an intensity that made the hair on my arms stand up. He watched my balanced gait, my heightened situational awareness, the exact way my eyes automatically swept the corners of the room before settling on the patient. I noticed his fingers tap twice on the bed rail. A habit. Counting entries. I prepared the IV tray in silence, keeping my face locked in my pathetic, submissive assistant persona. But as I began handling the sterile equipment, my muscle memory aggressively took over. My hands, forged in the chaotic fires of battlefield triage, moved with a fluid, lethal precision that simply could not be faked. I positioned the IV bag at exactly the right height without checking the measurement. I tore the packaging on the catheter with one clean pull. Small details. Invisible to civilians, screaming to a trained eye. I wiped his bruised arm with a sharp-smelling alcohol swab, my movements devoid of any wasted energy or civilian hesitation. "You don't look like the hired help here," he rasped suddenly, his voice rough like crushed gravel. I froze for a microscopic fraction of a second. My heart rate spiked, pounding against my ribs. I forced myself to push through. I slid the IV needle into his fragile rolling vein with a smooth, terrifyingly accurate precision that even the senior nurses on this floor couldn't replicate. I desperately tried to clumsily tape the line down to fake civilian incompetence, fumbling with the adhesive strip, but it was far too late. The retired Marine Major General narrowed his eyes, his gaze locked on the angle I held the needle, the way I'd instinctively positioned myself between him and the door. He didn't see a lowly janitor or a broken daughter. He saw a highly trained soldier operating under deep cover. He continued to study me, dissecting my every movement with the patience of a man who had spent decades reading soldiers. Attention to posture the way you secure the needle. No civilian medical assistant can do that. What branch officer? He barked. It wasn't a casual question. It was a direct, authoritative command issued by a superior officer. The commanding tone completely bypassed my conscious civilian brain and hit my spinal cord. Before my mind could even attempt to stop it, my back snapped rigidly straight, my shoulders squared aggressively, and my heels automatically clicked together in a flawless textbook position of attention. Army, sir. I responded instantly, my voice dropping a full octave into its natural authoritative command-level cadence. Pure, unadulterated horror washed over me the very instant the military title left my lips. I bit down on my lower lip so hard I instantly tasted warm copper. My secret was out, exposed by the very discipline I had spent a month trying to bury under bleach and dirty mop water. My body had betrayed me to the one man in this entire hospital who knew exactly what those reflexes meant. I had just exposed the fatal flaw in my entire self-imposed exile. The old general didn't yell for the nurses or announce my lie to the hallway. He simply smirked. It was a look of profound, silent understanding, shared traumatic pain, and undeniable pride. He had seen soldiers break before. He had watched young officers try to run from their own ghosts. And he recognized the specific haunted discipline of a combat surgeon carrying the unbearable weight of a life she couldn't save. Panicked by this raw, unexpected vulnerability, I blindly gathered my trash and medical supplies, practically fleeing the room. Once I reached the empty, sterile corridor, I pressed my back flat against the freezing cold wall. I squeezed my eyes shut, executing a desperate 4-count tactical breathing sequence to stop my hands from violently shaking. In that terrifying moment of exposure, I realized with absolute clarity that the honor and discipline of a combat soldier could never be entirely scrubbed away, no matter how much dirt and humiliation my dad threw on it. Arthur Miller had seen me, truly seen me, and that single act of recognition terrified me far more than any bullet I had ever dodged. The following morning, the pristine, quiet lobby was violently disrupted by a real, terrifying emergency. A 72-year-old woman was rushed through the automatic double doors on a gurney, desperately clutching her chest and gasping violently for air. Her family ran alongside, screaming for help, grabbing at every nurse in sight. My dad, always eager to play the brilliant hero in front of a wealthy family, immediately stepped in to orchestrate the case, completely taking over the trauma bay. I was pushing my heavy, squeaking cleaning cart past the open doors, but my trained eyes automatically locked onto her glowing monitor. I saw the tracheal deviation, the bulging jugular veins straining against her thin neck, and the uneven, desperately shallow rise and fall of her chest. Her right lung had collapsed. Her oxygen saturation was plummeting on the screen. This woman was dying, and everyone in the room was looking at the wrong man to save her. My combat-trained brain processed the data in milliseconds, completely overriding my janitor persona. This was not a standard panic attack. This was not a standard panic attack. This was a tension pneumothorax. The trapped air was building pressure against her heart, collapsing her airway from the inside. She needed an emergency chest tube and a needle decompression, not a prescription pad. But my dad, a man entirely used to pampering wealthy hypochondriacs and prescribing bed rest for profit, misread the entire critical situation. He barely glanced at her chart before making his ruling. He waved his hand dismissively at Sophie and delivered his verdict with the casual arrogance of a man who had never seen real death. She just has mild asthma, prescribe an aerosol regimen and low-dose steroids. He barked, already turning away to check his phone. I halted my cart so violently the wheels screeched against the tile. He was dead wrong. That exact medical protocol would flood her fragile system with fluid she couldn't expel and kill her within hours. The sacred oath of a combat medic surged through my veins like a massive shot of adrenaline. I took a deliberate half-step forward, my mouth opening the authoritative command to prep a chest tube and a needle decompression ready to fire off my tongue. I knew exactly what to do. I had performed this procedure dozens of times in the desert with nothing but a combat knife and a plastic tube. But right at that moment, my dad turned. His cold, calculating eyes locked directly onto mine. The look he gave me was filled with unadulterated, venomous disgust, a silent, crushing warning that screamed I had absolutely no right to breathe in his domain, let alone speak. That singular, hateful look was an invisible slap that physically choked the life-saving words right out of my throat. My hands clamped down on the plastic handle of my cleaning cart, my knuckles turning stark white as I violently suppressed my desperate urge to physically push him aside and take over. Sophie stood by the bed, dutifully following his wrong orders, drawing up the steroids that would push this woman closer to the edge. I watched, and I said nothing. A brutal, tearing war raged in my chest. Step in to save a dying woman's life and permanently expose my military rank, or maintain my miserable, self-imposed prison of shame. The paralyzing, deeply ingrained fear of his toxic power won the battle. I slowly lowered my head, completely breaking eye contact with the man who was about to commit medical manslaughter through sheer arrogance. I pushed the heavy cart away, retreating into the dark shadows of the hallway, leaving my screaming conscience bleeding on the ER floor. Behind me, the old woman's monitor alarm escalated to a frantic pitch. I heard Sophie call out in confusion, heard footsteps scrambling, heard my dad bark another wrong order. I kept walking. Each step was a knife twisting deeper into my gut. 20 minutes later, I heard the rapid, frantic paging system blast through the overhead speakers, calling the senior attending to the trauma bay for an emergency intervention. The old woman had crashed. Her lungs had filled completely exactly as I had predicted, and the steroid protocol my dad prescribed had accelerated the collapse. A real pulmonologist was eventually called in from the city, arriving nearly 40 minutes later to perform the emergency chest tube insertion that should have been done the moment she rolled through those doors. She survived, barely, spending 3 weeks in intensive care that could have been avoided if someone in that room had the courage to challenge a narcissist with a designer suit and a god complex. I found out later from Jenna, the young nurse who whispered the update to me while I was mopping the East Wing corridor. I gripped the mop handle until my forearms cramped, staring at the wet tile until Jenna walked away. I realized with sickening, horrifying clarity that my father's psychological grip was turning me into a silent, cowardly accomplice. This crushing, unbearable guilt set a massive fire in my stomach, paving the absolute way for the confrontation I could no longer avoid. Later that same afternoon, I returned to Arthur's private room to manually check his vitals. My chest felt like it was wrapped tightly in barbed wire after my cowardly retreat. The guilt was physically nauseating. I could still hear the frantic alarm of that old woman's heart monitor echoing in my skull. Arthur was waiting for me. He hadn't just been resting. He had seen everything through the partially open door of his suite, which faced the trauma bay across the corridor. He had watched my dad's vicious display in the hallway, my silent retreat, and the utter crushing defeat evident in my slumped posture as I pushed my cart past his room. He didn't look at me with the soft pity I was used to from the junior nurses. He looked at me with a profound, heavy disappointment that cut significantly deeper than any insult my dad could ever throw. He demanded my full attention immediately, not acting as a dying, fragile patient, but as a commanding officer addressing a soldier who had completely lost her nerve in the heat of battle. He saw right through my pathetic, self-deprecating armor. "You know, Martha," he rasped, deliberately using my real name instead of the demeaning assistant title my family forced on me. He leaned forward slightly, fighting his own failing lungs, his voice low and intensely focused. "Letting a terrible man, even if he is your biological father, trample on your dignity, that is not a sacrifice. That is an insult to the uniform you wore. You are disgracing the comrades who fell to protect those noble ideals." The words hit me center mass, a high-caliber round shattering the twisted, toxic logic I had used to survive the last 30 days. I tried to look away to maintain my stony facade, but his piercing gaze pinned me directly to the floor. He was systematically dismantling the prison I had built for myself, brick by brick, exposing the ugly truth that my suffering wasn't heroic. It was just another form of hiding. He didn't stop. He twisted the knife deeper, operating with the precision of a surgeon himself, cutting to save the patient on the table. "You run from pain by punishing yourself, but that self-punishment is killing the people around you." He gestured toward the hallway with a trembling hand, the same hallway where a woman had nearly died because I chose silence over duty. My knees physically buckled under the unbearable weight of the truth. I grabbed the cold metal bed rail to stay upright, my fingers turning white around the steel. The hot tears I had forcefully held back for months finally broke free. They didn't come gently. They came in violent, silent waves that shook my shoulders and stole my breath. I collapsed by his bedside, my forehead pressed against the cold rail, openly acknowledging my rank for the first time since I walked through those hospital doors. The agonizing, suffocating grief I had locked away poured out of me onto the sterile floor of a stranger's hospital room. A total stranger. An old man I had known for 2 days. He had just shown me the fierce empathy and unyielding protection that my own father actively denied me. Arthur placed his rough, calloused hand on top of my trembling head, grounding me as my emotional dam collapsed completely. He didn't offer comfort. He didn't tell me it was going to be okay. He let me break. He let the poison drain. Then, when my breathing finally slowed, he spoke again, his voice low and steady, despite his failing lungs. I lost 14 men in Korea. 14 boys I swore to bring home. You know what kept me alive afterward. Not guilt. Not hiding. I stood up the next morning and I made damn sure their sacrifice meant something. His oxygen concentrator hummed steadily in the silence between us. I pressed my face against the cold metal of his bed rail and let those words sink into the place where my father's cruelty used to live. I stayed awake the entire night, sitting on the bare floor of my apartment, staring blankly into the darkness. Arthur's words acted as a scalpel, violently cutting out the toxic, paralyzing rot my dad had planted deep in my mind. Enduring abuse was not a cure for my trauma. It was a cowardly escape from reality. That old woman in the trauma bay could have died because I chose my own fear over my oath. By the time the early morning sun rose, casting a gray light across my room, a cold, hard resolve settled heavily in my chest. I wiped my face, my expression hardening into stone. I pressed my palm flat against the kitchen counter and stood perfectly still, feeling the cold surface against my calloused skin. The slumped posture was gone. The dead eyes were gone. I was entirely done hiding in the shadows. I was done being a willing victim to my father's ego. And I was done letting innocent people suffer because of my cowardice. The stage was perfectly set, and my tactical mind was entirely clear for the massive storm that was about to hit Ward General Hospital. If Arthur's blunt truth hit you as hard as it hit me, take a second to like this video. And tell me in the comments, have you ever found the truest family in a complete stranger when your own blood turned their back on you? The fragile, arrogant peace of Ward Hospital was obliterated the very next afternoon. A deafening mechanical roar violently shook the building's foundation as a military Black Hawk helicopter, its engine screaming in a pitch that signaled catastrophic mechanical failure, made a desperate emergency landing directly onto the pristine landscaped courtyard. The massive rotor wash sent heavy patio umbrellas and potted plants flying like debris from an explosion. Inside the lobby, the crystal chandelier above the reception desk swung violently, raining tiny glass fragments onto Beatrice's immaculate station. She screamed, throwing her arms over her head. 8 soot-covered, heavily armed Delta Force operators kicked the luxury glass doors open, one of the heavy panes, spiderwebbing from the impact, and hauled in a young soldier on a blood-soaked field stretcher. The brutal, unforgiving reality of war had violently invaded my father's sanctuary of cosmetic surgery and elite privilege. The operators were screaming for a doctor, their voices cracking with raw desperation as they pushed past the terrified receptionists, leaving a thick, horrifying trail of fresh blood smeared across the imported marble floor. One operator's shoulder slammed into the decorative mahogany display case near the entrance, sending it crashing to the ground, shattering the glass shelves that held my dad's framed medical awards and honorary certificates. Another operator kicked aside a potted orchid arrangement worth more than my monthly cleaning salary, sending ceramic and dirt spraying across the pristine reception area. A decorative vase near the entrance exploded under a combat boot, porcelain and lilies scattering into the widening pool of blood. My dad's carefully curated empire of elegance was being physically demolished by the raw, brutal reality he had spent his entire career pretending didn't exist. Absolute paralyzing panic immediately consumed the lobby. My dad, a man who had built his entire medical empire on simple facelifts and treating wealthy hypochondriacs, turned ash white. He stared at the mangled flesh, the brutally exposed bone, and the sheer terrifying volume of blood pooling on his expensive floor. His hands hung at his sides, useless. His mouth opened and closed, but no command came out. The junior nurses scattered in every direction, screaming and covering their mouths, utterly clueless on how to handle massive blast trauma. Sophie backed into a wall and slid down to the floor. Rachel dropped an entire tray of instruments with a deafening crash. In that suspended second of pure civilian terror, the timid, abused janitor inside my head was executed. Shot clean through the skull without ceremony. The lethal, freezing calm of an army combat surgeon took complete control of my nervous system, instantly slowing my heart rate down to a steady, tactical rhythm. My pupils dilated. My breathing locked into a 4-count pattern. The supply closet, the mop bucket, the dirty gauze on my knees, all of it burned away in an instant. I was no longer Martha the janitor. I was Colonel Ward. And a soldier was dying on my floor. I stepped decisively out of the shadows of the hallway, my eyes rapidly scanning the catastrophic injuries on the stretcher, automatically calculating massive blood loss and structural damage in a heartbeat. Shrapnel wounds to the abdomen and chest. Probable internal hemorrhaging. Collapsed lung. He had minutes, not hours. I didn't ask for permission. I didn't hesitate or wait for my dad to issue a useless order. Beatrice. I roared, my voice forged in the deafening noise of artillery fire slicing cleanly through the civilian chaos. She flinched behind her shattered desk, mascara running down her face in black streaks. Prepare trauma operating room number 1 immediately. Turn the heating system up to maximum. Prepare 10 units of O-negative blood. Right now. I barked the orders with absolute, uncompromising authority, my stance wide, my finger pointing directly at her, demanding total obedience from a staff that had spent an entire month mocking me, pitying me, and watching me scrub their floors on my hands and knees. Beatrice jumped in sheer terror, dropping her clipboard with a loud clatter. She stared at me, her mouth hanging open, trying to reconcile the janitor she had tormented with the commanding voice that had just shaken the walls. My dad stood frozen in place, his own mouth gaping his immense financial power, and carefully maintained authority instantly neutralized by the sheer, undeniable gravity of death in the room. His designer suit suddenly looked absurd against the backdrop of blood and mud and screaming soldiers. I didn't wait for their slow civilian brains to catch up. I marched directly toward the blood-soaked stretcher, my path clearing as every nurse and receptionist instinctively stepped back. The Delta operators looked at me with wild, desperate eyes, ready to take orders from anyone who moved with purpose. I pressed 2 fingers against the young soldier's carotid artery, feeling the weak, thready pulse fighting to stay alive. I locked my jaw and started moving him toward the operating room, fully ready to rip this dying man away from the edge. We burst through the heavy double doors of the ER. Julian Cross was crashing fast. The heart monitor screamed a continuous frantic warning, the jagged green line dipping dangerously close to a flatline with every weak beat. I barked orders to the 2 nearest nurses as I moved, demanding surgical clamps, a chest tray, and suction. They scrambled, too shocked to question me. Marcus Vance, the Delta Force commander, burst into the trauma room directly behind the stretcher, his face completely covered in mud soot and the unmistakable residue of explosive detonation. My dad was standing near the head of the bed, his hands visibly shaking at his sides, his face drained of all color, acting utterly useless while desperately trying to project an aura of authority to the panicked nurses watching from the doorway. He grabbed a stethoscope from a nearby tray, a pathetic prop, to make himself look like he belonged in this room. Then Marcus locked eyes with me across the chaotic space. He stopped dead in his tracks, ignoring the blood soaking through his fatigues and the screaming alarms overhead. His mud-caked face registered instant, fierce recognition. Right in front of my dad, right in front of Beatrice, who was trembling by the supply cabinet, and right in front of Sophie and Rachel, who stood paralyzed in the doorway, Marcus snapped his heavy combat boots together and delivered a textbook military salute. "Colonel Ward Valkyrie, please save him." He bellowed, his voice cracking with immense respect and desperate, absolute hope. The sound of my rank and my battlefield call sign echoed off the sterile walls and hit every single person in that room like a freight train. The entire ER went dead silent save for the screaming heart monitor. My dad's jaw dropped open, his eyes bulging from their sockets, as his arrogant brain completely short-circuited trying to process the title, Colonel. The stethoscope slid from his limp fingers and clattered onto the tile. Sophie and Rachel stared at me like I had burst into flames right in front of them. Beatrice gripped the edge of the supply cabinet. Her powdered face twisted into an expression I had never seen on her before. Raw, unfiltered terror, mixed with the dawning realization that she had spent a month tormenting a superior military officer. I didn't say a single word to any of them. I stepped forward, my hands reaching up to grab the collar of the restrictive cheap assistant jacket I had worn like a prison uniform for 30 days. I gripped the synthetic fabric and ripped it open, the plastic buttons popping off and scattering across the bloody tile floor. I threw the torn garment to the ground. Underneath, the jagged, violent scars on my shoulders and forearms were fully exposed under the surgical lights, a visible map of every battlefield I had survived. My gaze was razor-sharp, completely stripped of any civilian warmth or submissive pretense. I marched straight to the operating table, radiating pure lethal authority, casting a massive shadow that swallowed my father's entire pathetic presence. My dad desperately tried to step in front of me, planting his expensive shoes directly in my path, attempting to salvage his rapidly crumbling pride in front of his own staff. His hand came up, palm out, a gesture he had used 1,000 times to silence me, to push me back into the shadows. I didn't slow down. I grabbed him firmly by the shoulder, my calloused fingers digging into the fine fabric of his designer suit, and shoved him aside with the controlled force of someone who had physically restrained panicking soldiers under mortar fire. He stumbled backward, his hip slamming against a metal equipment cart, sending a tray of sterile instruments crashing to the floor. Shocked, emasculated, completely and utterly powerless for the first time in his life inside his own building. "You are not qualified to handle this case, Director Ward. Step back immediately." I barked, my voice entirely devoid of emotion, cold as the steel instruments on the tray beside me. He tried to sputter a weak protest, his mouth forming words that had no sound, attempting to pull rank in his own hospital. But the absolute authority radiating from my eyes, combined with the imposing presence of Marcus and 2 Delta operators stepping forward to flank me, their hands resting on their sidearms, forced him to shrink back into deeply humiliated silence against the far wall. He pressed himself into the corner, his designer suit wrinkled and stained with the blood that had splattered across the floor. He looked small, fragile, irrelevant. I demanded the surgical tray and took the scalpel. The cold weight of the steel settled into my palm like an old friend returning after a long absence. The exact same hands they had relentlessly mocked for scrubbing toilets and picking up dirty gauze now moved with terrifying, blinding speed, clamping severed arteries with precise, practiced snaps of the hemostats, suctioning the chest cavity to clear the pooling blood obscuring my field, opening the thoracic wall with a single confident incision to relieve the massive pressure buildup crushing Julian's heart. I called out vitals, barked for units of blood, demanded clamp after clamp, orchestrating the entire room with absolute, unquestionable supremacy. Systolic dropping, hang the second unit and squeeze it. I need pressure now. Sophie fumbled with the blood bag, her fingers shaking so badly she nearly dropped it. I didn't look up from the incision. Squeeze it, Sophie. Both hands. He dies if you hesitate. She locked her jaw and squeezed the bag with everything she had, tears streaming silently down her face. Rachel held the suction tube exactly where I pointed her, earlier contempt completely annihilated by the raw, terrifying competence she was witnessing from the woman she had whispered about for a month. The nurses who had mocked me now handed me instruments with trembling hands, their eyes wide, following my every command without a syllable of hesitation. Not because I asked, because they understood for the first time that the only thing standing between this young soldier and a body bag was the janitor they had laughed at. My dad was forcefully relegated to standing in the corner like a scolded child, watching in mute, agonizing horror as his fake pride and civilian ego were entirely crushed by the true, undeniable power of a seasoned combat surgeon saving a human life. His empire of vanity, his crystal chandeliers and Italian marble meant absolutely nothing in this room. In this room, the only currency that mattered was skill, nerve, and the willingness to stand between a man and death. And he was bankrupt. The grueling surgery took over 2 hours. I stabilized Julian, completely systematically repairing the massive arterial damage, removing embedded shrapnel fragments, and reinflating the collapsed lung with a chest tube I inserted with the same mechanical precision I had used in a dusty field hospital 12 time zones away. The suffocating tension that had gripped the trauma room finally broke into a breathless collective exhale from the exhausted Delta operators standing vigil by the door. Julian's heart rate steadied on the monitor, the jagged green lines smoothing into a strong rhythmic pattern. I stepped away from the operating table, stripping off my bloody gloves with 2 sharp snaps. I dropped them into the biohazard bin without looking. I walked straight past my dad, completely ignoring his dumbfounded, pathetic stare and the absolute shamed silence of the nursing staff who stood pressed against the walls. I didn't look at Beatrice. I didn't look at Sophie or Rachel. I headed straight into the adjacent scrub room, needing isolation the way a soldier needs silence after the guns stop. I hit the faucet handle with my elbow, turning the water on maximum cold. I began violently scrubbing the blood, iodine, and grime from my forearms, a harsh, intensely grounding ritual I had performed 1,000 times in sweltering desert heat to wash away the adrenaline and the ghosts of the operating table. The freezing water numbed my skin, but it couldn't touch the exhaustion deep in my bones. The adrenaline was crashing. The room was quiet except for the rushing water and my own controlled breathing. The heavy metal door to the scrub room swung open slowly behind me, the hinges creaking against the silence. Marcus walked in. His broad shoulders were slumped, the battle urgency completely drained from his body. His expression was no longer frantic with the immediate panic of saving his soldier. It was heavy, dark, burdened with something far worse than combat. I recognized the look instantly. I had seen it on the faces of officers who had to deliver death notifications to families back in the States. He watched me scrub my hands for a long moment, the sound of rushing water filling the sterile silence between us. He didn't speak immediately. He was gathering himself, steeling his nerve the way a man braces before pulling a trigger. Finally, his voice dropped into a somber, formal, and painfully gentle register. "Colonel, there is something I have to report to you," he said quietly, his eyes fixed on a point just past my shoulder, unable to meet my gaze. My heart immediately seized in my chest, skipping a beat so hard I felt it in my throat. The lingering combat high evaporated in a millisecond, replaced by a cold, heavy dread pooling violently in the pit of my stomach. I slowly reached out and turned off the faucet. The sudden silence in the room was deafening, pressing against my eardrums. I braced my wet hands against the edge of the porcelain sink and waited for the impact. Marcus looked down at the tiled floor, taking a deep, shuddering breath before meeting my eyes with a look of absolute devastation. He pulled a folded photograph from the cargo pocket of his fatigues. It was creased and stained with dirt and something dark. He held it out to me, but I didn't take it. I didn't need to. I could see the face in the photo from where I stood. Elias Thorne. He died 6 months ago during a Doctors Without Borders mission in a war zone. The words hit me like a sledgehammer swung directly at the base of my skull. The scrub room tilted violently. The fluorescent lights above me blurred into a single blinding white streak. Elias, the comrade I had bled with in the dirt. The brilliant, fearless medic who had pulled me out of a collapsed structure with his bare hands. The man whose potential death I had run away from the military to avoid witnessing. The man I had been punishing myself for, convinced that he was alive somewhere out in the world, still saving lives with those steady hands, still laughing that deep, quiet laugh over cold coffee in a field tent. I had built my entire penance around the hope that one day when I was ready, when I had suffered enough to earn the right, I would find Elias and tell him I was sorry for running. I had rehearsed the words 1,000 times on the cold floor of my apartment, but the words were for a ghost. They had been for a ghost for 6 months. The horrifying math clicked in my brain with the cold precision of a tactical computer. He had been dead for 6 months. For half a year while I hid in this pathetic hospital, willingly letting my dad trample me just to escape my own fear, Elias was already buried in the ground. My entire existence over the last 30 days had been a pointless, agonizing farce built on the fear of a tragedy that had already occurred. Every insult I swallowed, every floor I scrubbed, every time I bit my lip until it bled, it was all for nothing. He was already gone. I broke completely. The iron discipline of the colonel shattered. My wet, raw hands gripped the porcelain edge of the sink so aggressively that my knuckles split open, smearing fresh blood against the white ceramic. A guttural, agonizing sound tore from somewhere deep in my chest, an animal noise that didn't sound human. A sound of pure, unadulterated heartbreak that bounced off the cold tiles and came back to hit me again. I slammed my fist against the porcelain. Then again. The skin across my knuckles ripped further, leaving dark red smears across the white surface. Marcus stepped forward and grabbed my wrist, stopping me from destroying my hands, the hands that had just saved his soldier's life. I tried to pull away, but he held firm, his grip steady and unbreakable. My entire coping mechanism was a lie. By hiding from the world in this toxic hospital, playing the victim to my father's ego, I had selfishly robbed myself of the final chance to say goodbye. I never attended Elias's funeral. I never stood over his grave. I never told him that he mattered more to me than anyone sharing my last name. The brutal, inescapable realization forced me to my knees on the wet tiles. Marcus lowered himself down beside me, still holding my wrist, saying nothing. There was nothing to say. I knelt on the cold, wet floor of the scrub room and accepted the horrifying truth that I could no longer run from. My self-punishment was infinitely worse than the reality I was trying to avoid. It didn't save me. It destroyed me. And it stole from me the only goodbye that ever mattered. Deep into the desolate hours of the night shift, the hospital fell into an eerie quiet, the earlier chaos having completely subsided. The blood had been mopped from the marble. The shattered glass had been swept up. The Delta operators had set up a perimeter around Julian's recovery room, and the hallways returned to their sterile, artificial calm. I sat in a hard plastic chair outside Arthur's room, my bandaged hands resting on my knees, staring at the far wall without seeing it. The grief for Elias sat in my chest like a stone, heavy, permanent, but no longer poisonous. Marcus's devastating report had burned away the last lie I had been telling myself. The pain was real now, clean, no longer filtered through self-inflicted punishment. Around 1:30 a.m., a sudden code blue alarm shattered the silence, the shrill electronic wail echoing through the empty corridor. Arthur. His end-stage heart failure had finally reached the point of no return. His body was shutting down. I sprinted down the dimly lit hallway, physically pushing past the frantic nurses who were scrambling with the crash cart. Arthur had signed a DNR weeks ago. He had refused further invasive measures. No CPR, no shocks. He had made his peace with the final mission. I burst into his room and immediately waved off the nurses who followed me in. He signed a DNR. I stated, my voice firm but quiet. No intervention. Leave us. They hesitated, looking at each other, then at the monitor. I held the door open and stared at them until they filed out. I closed the door behind them and stood by his bed in the dim blue light of the medical equipment. The proud, weathered old warrior faced his final battle with an aura of absolute, unshakable calm. His military decorations, a small framed set of service ribbons his family had brought in and placed on the bedside table, caught the faint light from the monitor. His chest rose and fell in shallow, irregular waves. The heart monitor beside him beeped in an erratic, slowing rhythm, each gap between beats stretching longer than the last. He opened his cloudy eyes and reached out toward me with trembling, incredibly fragile fingers. I immediately took his cold hand in both of mine, holding it with a gentle, firm grip, careful of the bandages on my split knuckles. His breathing was terribly shallow, a death rattle forming in his chest, but his eyes retained that fierce, unbroken pride of a Marine who had seen it all and feared nothing on the other side. Martha, never let anyone, not even this family, hold back who you truly are. He whispered, his voice, frail, raspy, but carrying the unmistakable heavy weight of a final command. Be proud of your rank. Be proud of those hands that save lives. He squeezed my fingers with the last of his strength. He was passing the torch, validating my entire existence in a way my father never could and never would. A dying stranger gave me the words my own blood had spent a lifetime withholding. Silent, heavy tears streamed down my face, washing away the very last remnants of my cowardice. I aggressively ignored every strict hospital protocol my dad had mandated about patient visitation hours and end-of-life care procedures. I walked to the heavy wooden door, locked it from the inside with a definitive click, and pulled the blinds shut to block out the sterile hallway. A nurse knocked once. I didn't answer. She tried the handle, found it locked, and walked away. I returned to the bed and sat on the edge, still holding his hand. In the dim, flickering light of the failing heart monitor, I held his cold fingers tightly against my chest, sharing the silent, profound bond of two seasoned soldiers sitting together in the dark, confronting the ultimate, inevitable enemy. He wasn't afraid, and because he wasn't afraid, I found the strength to stop being afraid too. I swore to myself I would not let him die alone in this superficial, hollow place. The hours passed in a heavy, sacred silence. The heart monitor's beeping slowed to a crawl, each electronic pulse separated by a gap so long I held my breath waiting for the next one. His breathing thinned until it was barely a whisper across his cracked lips. I pressed my forehead against his hand and closed my eyes. Finally, at 2:45 a.m., the erratic beeping ceased, entirely replaced by a long, continuous tone. The jagged green line went completely flat. General Arthur Miller was gone. I sat motionless for a full minute, listening to that steady, final tone fill the room. Then I gently placed his lifeless hand across his chest, straightening his fingers the way an honor guard would arrange a fallen soldier before the flag was draped. I pushed my chair back silently, and rendered a slow, deeply respectful salute in the darkness of the room. My right hand trembled but held firm at my brow for a full 5 count. In the peaceful, heavy silence of his passing, the very last of my psychological chains shattered into dust. I couldn't save Elias from the war zone. I arrived too late for that goodbye. But I was here fully present for Arthur. I honored a soldier's final moments the way they deserve to be honored, not with my dad's sterile protocols and cold insurance paperwork, but with the silent, unwavering vigil of a fellow warrior. My internal healing was complete. I was absolutely, irrevocably done with my father's psychological games, his toxic legacy, and the suffocating prison of the Ward family name. Dawn broke over the city. The first warm, golden rays of sunlight hit the hospital's massive glass windows, cutting through the sterile air and painting long streaks of amber across the marble floor. I walked out of Arthur's room, gently pulling the door closed behind me with a soft click. I stood in the corridor for a long moment, feeling the weight of the night settle into my bones. Then I straightened my spine one final time. I walked down the main hallway with my posture impeccably straight, my shoulders squared, my chin level. My boots, still spattered with Julian's dried blood, clicked rhythmically against the tile. 2 of the Delta operators standing guard outside Julian's recovery room snapped to attention as I passed. I returned a curt nod without breaking stride. Every nurse I passed pressed themselves against the wall. Beatrice was at her station, the shattered glass display case behind her still not repaired, the empty frames and broken awards shoved into a cardboard box at her feet. She lowered her eyes to the floor the second she saw me coming. Sophie clutched her clipboard against her chest and turned her body away, pressing her shoulder into the wall. Rachel stood near the supply closet, the same closet where I used to hide, and she physically flinched when my boots clicked past her. Jenna, the young nurse who had once asked if I was okay, stood at the end of the corridor. She didn't look away. She met my eyes and gave me a single, barely visible nod. I returned it. Then I kept walking. None of the others spoke. My dad was waiting near the main exit. He hadn't gone home. He had been standing in the lobby for hours, pacing, rehearsing, calculating. His face was a pathetic, frantic mix of shock, deep confusion, and greedy, desperate calculation. He forced a fake, appeasing smile, already pivoting, already scheming to leverage my revealed rank to boost his hospital's flagging reputation and cover up the years of his own incompetence. He stepped toward me with his hands outstretched, palms up, a gesture of manufactured warmth that made my stomach turn. "Martha, my daughter. I didn't know you were. We can start over. This hospital needs someone like you." He stammered, his voice cracking with the effort of pretending 30 days of relentless cruelty had never happened. I stood perfectly still, 3 feet from the man who had kicked medical waste onto my kneeling body, who had spoken about me as if I were a broken appliance, who had silenced me while a patient nearly died from his own arrogance. I stared at him with eyes as cold and unforgiving as glacial ice. He looked smaller than I remembered. His designer suit was wrinkled from the night's chaos, hanging slightly loose on his frame, as if the events had physically shrunk him. His hands hovered in the air between us, trembling, waiting for the embrace he expected to receive. I didn't argue. I didn't yell. I didn't list his sins or explain my pain. I simply reached down, picked up a spare, cheap medical assistant coat from a nearby chair. The same synthetic fabric that had suffocated my scars for a month, balled it up tightly in my fists, and threw it aggressively onto his expensive, polished leather shoes. It landed with a soft thud, a physical symbol of the trash he had continuously tried to turn me into. He flinched, stumbling back half a step, completely taken aback by the absolute lack of emotion in my eyes. There was no anger, no tears, no satisfaction. Just a cold surgical finality that told him this incision was permanent and there would be no sutures. I don't belong here, and I don't belong to you. I stated with absolute chilling finality, cutting through his pathetic web of lies and manipulation with 6 words that carried more force than any scalpel I had ever held. His fake smile collapsed. His hands dropped to his sides, limp and useless. His mouth opened to form another plea, but nothing came out. I reached deep into the pocket of my tactical pants and pulled out the crisp military business card Marcus had pressed into my palm the night before, during the long hours of silence in the scrub room after the surgery. I gripped it tightly, feeling the sharp, clean edges against my fingertips, a tangible, undeniable anchor to my true identity. My real purpose and my actual family. The family that earned their bond through blood and sacrifice, not through shared genetics and conditional love. I was no longer the broken victim seeking validation from a narcissist. I was Colonel Martha Ward, call sign Valkyrie, and I had a life to reclaim. I turned my back on my dad without another word. Behind me, I heard his breath catch. I heard the soft scrape of his expensive shoes shifting on the marble as his weight faltered. I didn't turn around. I left him standing speechless and powerless in the echoing hallway, the crumpled assistant coat still sitting on his shoes, his arms hanging limply at his sides. The man who had towered over my entire childhood, who had filled every room he entered with his booming voice and suffocating authority, was now a small, silent figure shrinking in my peripheral vision. His reflection in the polished marble floor looked fractured, distorted, diminished. I took long, confident military strides toward the exit, my boots clicking in a steady, unwavering cadence against the tile. Each step carried me further from the man who had tried to crush me, and closer to the life I had earned in blood and fire. The automatic glass doors slid open with a quiet hiss, welcoming me with the brilliant, blinding morning sun that flooded my face with warmth I hadn't felt in months. I didn't look back. Not at the shattered glass that still hadn't been replaced. Not at the blood stain on the marble that the cleaning crew couldn't fully remove. Not at the small broken man standing alone in the lobby of his hollow empire. The Valkyrie had fully awakened from her nightmare. I was free. I was immensely proud of who I was. And I would never bow my head to him or anyone else again. I stepped out into the bright light, the military card pressed firmly in my palm, completely ready to return to the only place my hands truly belonged. If my journey to reclaim my honor inspired you to cut toxic ties, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more true stories. And drop a comment below. Have you ever had to walk away from family to finally find yourself?